India has pushed the pedal in a bid to accelerate our hopes for a greener future. Our move to green energy has seen a number of government schemes and efforts from the private sector as well. So, in the latest, in a bid to aid India's decarbonization efforts, Indian Oil, L&T and ReNew Power are coming together to form a joint venture and develop the country's nascent green hydrogen sector. The companies will hold equal stake in the JV, which will primarily focus on developing and owning green hydrogen assets in India. To speak more on this and India's broader renewables push, I'm joined by Chairman and Managing Director of ReNew Power, Sumant Sinha. Mr. Sinha, great to have you back on the show. Let's begin by talking about the announcement today and how it aids in the larger story and the larger efforts towards a greener future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Naman. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. Look, I think what is actually emerging now very rapidly is that green hydrogen is going to be a very important transition fuel in the sense that it'll really bridge renewable electricity or renewable energy going into a much broader part of the energy value chain. It is a very flexible resource. It can be used for through ammonia into a number of areas as feedstock. It can be used as a fuel. It can also, of course, be used in the mobility sector. So green hydrogen is actually a very versatile energy repository or holder. And the way you produce green hydrogen is essentially a very simple process. You just have to pass electricity through water. You separate that out into hydrogen and oxygen. And that electricity that is passed is actually used through or produced by renewable energy sources, and therefore it's green. So all of this, therefore, ends up producing a very clean energy source in the form of green hydrogen, and that therefore is going to be extremely important in India's and in fact the world's energy transition efforts as we go forward. So to my mind, therefore, green hydrogen is a very significant game changer and will really allow us to get into a number of areas of the energy transition that otherwise might have been difficult to get to. And it also therefore expands by a huge measure the amount of renewable energy capacity that we require to make that green hydrogen. So it's actually quite a long-term positive thing for the Indian economy as well.
Absolutely. But having said that, Mr. Sinha, there's a report recently that India is set to miss its renewable energy target of 175 gigawatts by the end of 2022. Can you put in context that we have all of these great ideals, great plans, investments and money and the push going towards moving to renewable energy, but what is the situation on ground which makes implementation challenging? And do you agree with the assessment I spoke about from this report?
Look, the reality is that the Indian government had set a target of getting to 175 gigawatts of wind and solar and some other renewables by 2022. And that number is obviously going to be missed. Now, the reason for that are several. Number one, of course, is the fact that COVID slowed down a lot of implementation. Over the last 2 years, we actually could not get a lot of the projects implemented. And it's not just renewable energy projects. Keep in mind there is also transmission infrastructure that had to be built out that got delayed. So I think that is something that has caused some of the delays. Hopefully, we'll be able to catch up on a lot of that over the next year or two. So I think you'll see some increased capacities getting commissioned over the next couple of years' time, and that will hopefully allow us to catch up. The second reason really is that we have a fundamental problem, which we all are aware, which is the nature of our distribution utilities. And I've spoken about that many times. And the reality is that is a problem. Our distribution utilities, unfortunately, are owned and run by the by the state governments of India. They're not in the control of the central government. And they have their own timelines about buying power and how they want to buy it and so on. And all of that is unfortunately also leading to a slowdown in implementation of renewable energy projects and actually any kind of projects. And frankly, you're likely to see fairly significant shortages emerging over the next 2-3 years in the power sector because the utilities have not, unfortunately, planned out their power purchase requirements over the next several years properly. So I think unless this structural issue is resolved of the utilities being in the hands of the state governments and a lot of them being run for not necessarily fully commercial reasons, this is always going to be a problem that is going to bedevil the Indian power sector.
So, to add to some of those issues that you have talked about, Mr. Sinha, we also have a new taxation structure which has come into place from the 1st of April, specifically in the context of solar power and the import of certain components required for solar power. The idea is to encourage the local industry, but when we speak to players on the ground, they do talk about a gap between when all of these components will be available locally and the high charges they will now have to pay. What do you think is going to be the impact in the short term for the move to solar?
Yeah, look, this is certainly an issue. I agree with you that we now have customs duties on solar panel imports, which makes it expensive. And at the same time, there are various projects that have to be commissioned fairly soon, and there simply is not enough domestic production capacity. And so, to that extent, either those projects will have to get delayed and the government will have to condone those delays, or frankly, I really don't see any other solution because the customs duty is now has come into effect, and it's some of us were asking for it to get postponed so that in fact this issue would not be as acute as it might become now. Look, the government I think is cognizant of this, and that is why they have allowed a 6-month extension for on certain other measures that were there to allow the imports of solar modules for some of the CNI segment. So I think to some extent the government is trying their bit to relax some of these constraints. But I do agree with you that unless we have a lot of new capacity develop, we'll see a slowdown in solar installations.
Mr. Sinha, you've recently also taken over as ASSOCHAM president. And it would be interesting to get your perspective on industry, which is now facing quite an interesting time. We've been through 3 waves of COVID-19, and then now we've been hit by a war, which has marred global supply chains once again. It's another sort of push that industry has faced. Inflation is a big problem, and the impact it will have on consumption. What is the outlook right now for industry, in your view?
Look, I think that there is a very kind of a dichotomous situation for Indian industry right now. On the one hand, the domestic economy is growing very robustly. Demand is picking up, especially as the pandemic waves, wanes. Demand is really picking up, and we see that, for example, in our sector, in the context of power demand going up very substantially, and therefore, what we are seeing is that at the same time, the financial sector is delevered and is much healthier. Corporate balance sheets have by and large delevered as well. And so both on the supply side and the demand side, there is, I think, likely to be a fairly good environment for a fairly significant growth going forward. So I see that happening. So from a domestic environment standpoint, things are looking fairly robust. Having said that, you are absolutely right that internationally, the environment is not looking that positive. Obviously, there are a lot of risks that are there. The first of those are the fact that interest rates are going to start getting increased and liquidity is going to start getting drained out from the system. So that's one. The second, of course, is the fact that supply chains are all over the place. And now with the war in Russia and Ukraine and COVID issues in China, that's not helping either. And a bad situation is actually getting worse as a result of that. And thirdly, of course, the fact that we have the energy shock that is currently upon us. So all of that is really making the external environment a lot more difficult to deal with. And the question is how much of that will be passed into India, either through the export sector or the external sector, versus, for example, dollars leaving the country and therefore the RBI having to take some action. So we don't know how much of that will get transmitted into India or in the form of higher inflation. So we have to wait and see. So I think it's a little bit of a both a good thing happening on the one hand, and I think a negative external situation on the other hand. So I think both of those will play themselves out. But I would say by and large, to be honest, I am relatively bullish about the near-term business environment in India over the next several years.
But Mr. Sinha, does that bullishness translate, and I'm not talking about you in particular, to India Inc. now sort of focusing on increasing private investment. That has been one area of concern over the last many years, and COVID-19 compounded all of that. There was caution. One didn't know if demand would return. Do you think the mood is changing?
I certainly think so. I think the mood has been changing over the last many months. And as I said, with the economy growing at 8% last financial year and looking at 7 to 8% this year. And as I said, there are these structural reasons as to why I think now the economy is set for above trend growth for the next several years. So from that standpoint, certainly I am positive. And there are many sectors that are showing that uptrend. As I said, the power sector, which is in some ways an input sector into so many other sectors, is showing a significant improvement. And that therefore is, to me, an indicator that the rest of the economy is also starting to do well. And there are many sectors where you'll start seeing this reflected in the infrastructure sectors. Road building is at an all-time high. Real estate prices are going up, especially in the commercial side. And you look at that'll feed into the cement sector and so on. So I think there are many sectors where you see this happening. The financial sector is also by and large doing very well. So I think overall, I think all the indications are fairly positive.
What about the crude shock? We spoke about the crude shock briefly, but I think it deserves a little more analysis, Mr. Sinha, in terms of, a lot of the sectors that you described doing well are also in part of high input costs and inflation that they have to also pass on. Do you think India is poised to withstand this crude shock? And in a sense, do you think it will be the right push we need to hasten our renewable energy plan?
Yeah, look, I totally agree with you that certainly this is an area of concern. Obviously, India is very impacted by oil prices. But I think the good news is, look, oil prices have gone up to a high of 135, 140. They've now trended back to about 105. The US has decided to release its strategic petroleum reserves. That alleviates the supply situation a little bit more. And look, the Indian rupee, despite this, has been relatively steady, which I think shows the fact that our external trade and services sector is doing very well. Capital flows continue to happen at a fairly robust level as well. So I think as long as the rupee stays stable, that cuts one sort of level of transmission of inflation into the Indian economy. My suspicion is that once the whole conflict situation settles down, which hopefully will happen soon enough, then you'll start again seeing a correction in oil prices. So to my mind, some of these things are temporary in nature and will not lead to structural price increases in India, and therefore will not really cause a significant inflation shock in the long run. So I would be cautiously optimistic about the fact that the energy shock will not be too negative for India to handle this time. I think the economy is a lot stronger. Now, as far as the move to renewable energy is concerned, of course, I mean, that is an absolute given. And I was at the International Energy Agency conference in Paris just about 10 days ago. And the topic of conversation is really about how do you meet energy security needs in the short run, which may need a short run ramping up of fossil fuels. But in the longer term, there has to be a very, very clear push towards renewables, which can be within your borders, green hydrogen, and those things are really, really going to see a very significant speeding up in their implementation, not just in India, but everywhere in the world, because this whole issue of energy security is now going to add to the climate change imperative, and both are going to move the whole area of renewables and the clean energy transition much, much faster now.
All right, one can only hope so. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinha. Pleasure as always to speak with you on the show.
Thank you, Tamanna. Thank you so much.
Thank you.